Good morning. This short presentation looks at a burial tradition in Ireland, which involves families trying their best to bury their dead as near as possible to the sanctuary or altar end of medieval Irish churches. The presentation will look at the origins of this tradition, how it has developed, and the direct and indirect impacts that this tradition has on the ruins of medieval Irish churches. The focus of the presentation are church sites in County Kerry. County Kerry is the most southwesterly county in Ireland. It's mainly peninsular. It's also the most mountainous county in Ireland. And it contains 89 archaeologically protected graveyards, of which 56 contain, or at one time did contain, medieval or earlier church sites. The map on the slide on the right-hand side shows you the location of these church sites. Now, there is the tradition of reuse of burial monuments goes back quite a long way across Europe, and in Ireland goes back to the early Neolithic with the construction of megalithic tombs. Some of the great passage tombs of Ireland, like Newgrange and Knowth, have evidence of being reused for burial right into the early medieval period. In Kerry itself, the oldest megalithic tomb is a portal tomb from Killiclahan. There's a pair of these tombs which were excavated and researched over the last 5 years. And you can see Killiclahan 1 on the slide on the left-hand side. And they date to around 3,800 BC. But both tombs were in use for burial, reused over and over and over again, right into the Iron Age. So a period of use extending over almost 4,000 years. Now, in the prehistoric period, it is assumed at this stage that the reuse of these monuments was a way of constructing linkages back to the past and establishing ancestral rights to land and resources at a time where land ownership and resources from the land were becoming increasingly important with the adoption of agriculture. On the slide on the right-hand side, you see 2 late Bronze Age hair rings, which were found in one of the tombs from one of the later phases of burial. So here in Kerry, as in other parts of Ireland and across Europe, megalithic tombs were reused over and over and over again to establish ancestral rights and tenure to land and the resources from that land. Christianity arrived in Ireland sometime around 400 AD, and this cult of the ancestors, which seems to have developed in the early Neolithic across Europe, morphed in some ways into what we would call the cult of relics. And basically, it is the veneration of the remains of saints and holy men as a way of establishing a connection to the divine. And I suppose the earliest physical representation of this veneration of corporeal relics is the building of shrines and the use of what are known as reliquaries. And on the slide on the left-hand side, we see what is known as a gable shrine from a church site at Kilboonia, again in County Kerry. And you can see the hole in the slab at the end is what's known as a fenestella. And this is where the hand of a supplicant would be placed into the shrine, which was basically like a gabled house, and the remains of the founding saint could be touched as part of the veneration. And these shrines are very often built on mounds or areas of stone called lochs, and burials are inserted in here over time. Again, this idea of reusing the site or trying to bury as close as possible to the remains of a saint or holy man in his role as the patron of a clan or tribe. And on the slide on the right-hand side, you see a very famous Irish reliquary, the Shrine of St. Lachlan's Arm, which is supposed to contain the arm bones of St. Lachlan. And this reliquary would have been taken out on holy days and feast days and venerated as part of the rites of the early monastic church. Now, a number of the burial grounds in Kerry date to the early medieval period. In other words, we're talking about the kind of 6th to the 9th centuries. And the churches in these sites would have been early oratories, stone oratories like the surviving one at Gallerus. But very often these early oratories are no longer visible. And it's usually only by the clustering of early burials that we can identify the former location of these oratories. So on the slide on the left-hand side, you see a church site at Dunurlan near Dingle, and you will notice the rough, unhewn grave markers clustered in a mounded area in the centre of the photograph. And these stones are quite possibly from the early oratory itself and indicate where it formerly stood. And on the slide on the right-hand side, you see another early site at Unballia Dove. And again, the oratory here has been completely destroyed, and most of the stone markers you can see in the photograph are probably again from stones at the oratory. And you can see in the background a number of stone tombs, again, probably built from the stone construction stones of the oratory itself having completely disappeared. So we can see that even as early as the first 300 years of Christianity in this area, that the reuse of the stones from the monument and a desire to bury the dead as close as possible to where the oratory had stood. Now, just I suppose as a way to show that not all the medieval church ruins in County Kerry are collapsing or in a very unstable condition. These are two church sites where the church ruins are in particularly good condition. And the reason for this, as you can see in both photographs, is that there are less burials than there are in some of the ones that I will show you after this. And equally so, the burials are later. So while the church sites themselves probably date in both cases to the late 15th, early 1600s, you can see that the burials, a lot of the burials are quite modern. There's none of the early markers that we have seen in the two previous slides. And as such, because of less burial activity in and around the structural walls of the church ruins, these two churches are in particularly good condition. The slide on the left-hand side shows Connolly Church near a town called Ballybunion, and the slide on the right-hand side shows Derrycoo Church, which you can see has very, very few burials at all, and very few of them built up against or underneath the walls of the church ruin itself. Now, there is a tradition that's very strong in certain parts of Ireland of the building of tombs. These are basically, as the name would imply, above ground vaults where the bodies were put into the tombs, and in the end you're left with just a collection of bones, almost like an ossuary. And on the slide on the left-hand side, we see Kilfeheny Church, and you can see quite clearly in it that numerous tombs have been built on top of and against the outline of the structural walls of the medieval church. And many of these tombs are, again, like in the earlier slide, built from the cut stone in particular from the church itself. And this cut stone usually occurs around doors, windows, and the corners of the structural walls. And the removal of this stone, needless to say, destabilizes the church ruin. But then the continued building and maintenance of the tombs that have been built in around the church walls continually undermine and destabilize the walls. On the slide on the right-hand side, you see kind of the ultimate expression of this desire to build tombs as close as possible to the sanctuary end of the church, where the surviving nave of a church at a church site called Killeen has completely been taken over by a family and converted into one very, very large tomb with a vaulted roof on top. You can see on the gable end the remaining window of what would have been the nave of the original church. Now I'm going to have a look at some examples where structural damage has been caused by burial, and then at how this structural damage increases the climate risk at these church sites. So the current slide, we're looking at a church site called Kilnanear. The church here probably dates to the late 1500s and would have been a small medieval parish church. And on the slide on the left-hand side, you can see two freshly dug burials on the ground, which have caused the collapse of a corner of the junction of the gable and the side wall of the church. And on the slide on the right-hand side, you can see where in 2013, the gable has substantially collapsed because of this undermining by burials, both the recently dug ones in 2009 and other burials that you can see in the foreground of the second slide that have been inserted around the base of the wall. This is another slide showing structural damage from burial. This is a church site called Kilbenane, and you can see on the slide on the left-hand side the church in 2008, when the first collapse event occurred following the insertion of a burial. You can see a headstone here right at the corner, and on the outside, which you can't see on this slide, a family plot was extended right in against the base of the wall, which again caused collapse of the corner where the gable, the east gable and the side wall met. And on the slide on the right-hand side, you can see this church in 2009. And you can see that once the initial collapse occurred, numerous other collapse events have happened. And you can see here where the northern side wall has completely gone. And if you look back at the first slide on the left-hand side, you can see that there are burials inserted just under a bulge in the wall where the wall has begun to collapse into the softer ground left by the excavation of the burial. So these two slides basically show you how the burial tradition, the tradition of trying to bury as close as possible to the sanctuary or altar end of the church, initiates a chain reaction where there is direct structural damage to the church, and then subsequent collapse occurs very often due to climate change. And just if we look at an example of a direct impact from climate change where one event literally destroyed one of these churches, this is a church site at Kilshannig on the Dingle Peninsula. And on the slide on the left-hand side, you can see the church in 2009 with the east gable substantially intact. You can equally see in the picture that in the foreground, there are a number of burials inserted at the base of the gable, and you can see where the mortar has already begun to wash out from the base of the wall. And the slide on the right-hand side shows the church in April of 2011, where the whole gable was blown down in a major storm in the very first days of January 2011, basically destroying the church in one climate change event. This has happened in a number of cases. And equally, we have had churches that have been blown down during major storms in the last 10 years, very often as a result of the maintenance of tombs and graves that have been placed around the walls. And what I mean by this is that an awful lot of these church ruins are held together by ivy that has colonized the walls and basically formed a lattice work around the walls, holding the unmarked stones in place. But very often when burials like these are inserted in around the walls, and particularly where tombs are inserted in around the walls, the maintenance of these tombs means that the family comes and they remove the ivy from the tomb, but at the same time kill the ivy that is holding the church walls together. And once this ivy is removed, inevitably the church walls will collapse or be blown down in a storm. And we have had 4 major collapses as a result of the removal of ivy since 2014. Here now I'm going to look at one particular church site, Churchdown Medieval Parish Church, which is a structure that has suffered a huge amount of damage, both from burials and subsequently from climate change. On the slide on the left-hand side, you can see where A burial has been inserted right against the wall. And what I hope you can see in the photograph is that the wall directly above the burial has begun to slump. In other words, a section of the wall has dropped slightly into the softer ground left by the excavation of the burial, and stones have begun to pop from the outer face of this wall, initiating what is basically the undermining of the wall. And on the slide on the right-hand side, you can see where the insertion of 3 older burials has undermined the gable, and you can see the beginnings of the collapse of the centerpiece of the gable into the softer ground left by the graves. Now, the softer ground here too also retains more moisture than the ground that is unexcavated either side, and this softening of basically the foundations is very often what causes these slumpings of the walls you can see on the slide on the left-hand side, and the undermining you can see here at the gable on the slide on the right. And this is Churchtown in 2009 and 2019. The same church site as the previous slide. And you can see this is the inner face of the gable that was undermined in the previous slide. And you can see that in 2009, the gable, while damaged and while there is washout of mortar, is still intact mainly and is still attached to the side walls of the church. You can also see that the cut stone on the central window has been removed, particularly the arch stones at the top, which has left it in an unstable condition. And this is the gable in 2009, following a number of collapse events, most of them recorded immediately after particularly heavy rainfall events since 2011. And you can see now at this stage that the top of the gable has collapsed, and that the gable has separated into 2 pieces because all of the stone along the line of the central window, both above it and below it, has washed out. And more importantly, you can see that the removal of stone from the corners and the undermining by burials has led to the washing out of all the mortar along the corners, and you can see that the gable is no longer attached to the side walls on one side, on the right-hand side, and is beginning to separate on the left-hand side. This gable, as you can see, is inevitably going to collapse, and there is no argument really that the undermining of the gable by burials and the subsequent washing out of mortar, particularly during heavy rainfall events, has accelerated very much in the last 10 years, and the gable will inevitably collapse. So basically, I hope that this short presentation has shown you that the tradition of burial that we're talking about, this desire to bury the dead as close as possible to the altar end of these medieval churches, has a very, very long history and has roots that go back into the Neolithic. The tradition itself then morphed slightly during Christianity, but continued to reuse monuments and to basically destroy monuments in a desire to reuse stones from them, to create that linkage back to holy men, saints, in their roles as patrons of clan groups, and that the excavation and maintenance of these graves undermines and damages the walls of these church rooms. The rate of deterioration of these rooms has increased quite a lot in the last 10 years, and in tandem with increased extreme rainfall events and storm frequency. And this has led to the collapse of a number of structures, and as observed and as shown in the slides, has left others in a very precarious state, the collapse of which is inevitable. Now, this leads you to the question then about, how can we preserve these churches? But the first question that probably has to be asked is it the tradition that should be preserved? The tradition is, as you can see, very well rooted and won't easily be stopped. In one case in Kerry, we have had legal proceedings taken by 2 families in relation to the extent of the burial plots in the altar section of a church. And one family requested permission to exhume bones in the church to use DNA to prove that they had the right to bury at the altar end of the church, and that the extent of their plot was as they said it was. So you can see that even in the modern age, this tradition continues. and will not easily be stopped. And it does beg the question whether we really should try and stop the tradition. Is the tradition less worthy of protection than the ruins? And as the Irish proverb says, is treasure ducus ná lúnd, tradition is stronger than learning. We might decide to put an embargo on these burials, but it's unlikely that we would be able to police it. Most of these churches are in isolated rural areas. And even if we could police it, there is nothing to prevent people from going in an evening or whatever, which often happens, and excavating for a burial and inserting a body. So it's the people in the end that will decide which survives, these church ruins or the tradition. And based on the Irish proverb, you would have to say they probably favour tradition. So in the long run, we're in a situation where the mitigation measures we would need to actually preserve the churches are in conflict with the tradition. And this is a dichotomy that I think we will meet in a number of situations in dealing with climate change and in the general conservation of monuments, where very often a traditional use of these monuments is at odds with the measures that we would like to see put in place to preserve them. I hope that the presentation was interesting, and thank you for listening.
Okay.